Hey there, DGS A&P. Let's talk about dermatomes, proprioception, reflex arcs, and some disorders of the nervous system. Let's get right into this. Dermatomes, these are essentially maps that help us know where sensory nerves serve on our skin. So derma, of course, means skin. And if you look at a dermatome, what this will tell you, if you look carefully at the map of this human body, is what particular destination sensory nerves have in terms of going back into the spinal cord. This is particularly useful in case um, a person is having some type of injury or problem with numbness or perhaps even weakness in their periphery of their body. So, for example, if we have some weakness in the right hand, in the pinky, and in the ring finger, or maybe some numbness, like you can't really feel anything here, if we know the dermatome here, we can map back the problem. Where in the neck is the problem? So this is essentially knowing which particular nerves serve which particular skin segments in terms of our touch and um, uh, perception of feelings in our skin. So these things are diagnostically useful in case people are having some type of numbness or weakness problem. When we think about how our spinal nerves are sending signals to and from our body um, all the time, one of the things that our spinal nerves are doing, and we don't even realize, is just maintaining a normal degree of uh, contraction in our muscles or tension in our muscles. And it's not something we think about. Um, so muscle tone is the degree to which those nerves are actually keeping our muscles semi tight, if you will, right? Developing some tension. When there isn't enough muscle tone, this can be a sign that there's an issue with the nervous system. And during development of human babies, this is not something we want to see. Hypotonia is decreased muscle tone. So when babies are growing, sometimes doctors will do a variety of tests to check that development is proceeding correctly. And sometimes a doctor will put a baby on the examination table and lift up their hands like this and go, oogie, 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 come here, baby. And what we want to see, what doctors want to see, is baby lifting his or her head and keeping it in line with the spinal column. Um, and if it's not, if that baby is letting its head roll back, or if you hold the baby by its abdomen and it's allowing its spine to curve and the extremities are sort of hanging like this, and instead of baby doing sort of active Superman, which is sort of an instinctual reflex response, this is a sign of hypotonia, which is decreased muscle tone, which may mean that there could be an issue with how the spinal nerves are developing and just the course of development of the child after all. And a baby who exhibits this kind of characteristic is going to be prescribed some physical therapy pretty quickly. And physical therapy can do wonders for these kids too. Sometimes you go to the doctor and the doctor whacks you on the knee, right? Or other tests can be done. The doctor, he or she might whack you here, or maybe in the back of your foot, or maybe behind your elbow. What this is doing is actually um, whacking you in some tendons. All right. This knee here, what this is a patellar tendon, right? We've got the biceps tendon here. This is the calcaneal tendon or the Achilles tendon. So what's happening there is the doctor is testing your reflexes. So why is that important, right? Well, what we've got here is a diagram of what are called sensory neurons that detect stretch in the tendons. All right. So when you're whacked on the knee or when you're whacked on the elbow, what's going to happen is that tendon gets deflected a little bit, and so it gets stretched out. Well, what are we looking for here? All right, when a doctor, when she's going to whack you on this knee, what that's going to do is stretch that tendon, and it's going to stretch some of the muscles of your quadriceps, right? The vastus lateralis, medialis, rectus femoris, vastus intermedius. And what that's doing when that tendon and when that muscle gets stretched, there's a what's called a muscle spindle, which detects that stretch in the muscle. And there can also be detection of stretch in the tendon here. And that's going to send a signal back to this posterior root. And that's going to cause a reflex to cause your quadriceps muscles to contract. And it's going to send an inhibitory reflex to um, relax your hamstrings muscles. So we've all probably done that, right? You get whacked on the knee by your doctor and your foot jumps out a little bit. Well, so why is that important? Well, I don't know if you've ever been standing at a locker and you're facing your locker and one of your friends comes up to you and bumps you behind the knee, right? If your knee suddenly flexes, well, you're going to lose some of that rigidity of your bone structure holding you up, right? So your legs pretty immediately need to have muscle contractions so that you don't fall over, right? You need to be constantly responding to the contraction or the relaxation or the changing angles of your muscles all the time to try to hold yourself up but not fall over. This type of reflex is really important for our body positioning and sort of coordination. This is another diagram just showing you what a muscle spindle is. And I don't know if you know what a spindle is, but a spindle is basically like a round dowel type thing which yarn or string could be spun around. So that's why it's called a spindle here. And the sensory apparatus here literally has nerve endings wrapped around muscle fibers. And so when those muscle fibers get elongated, this sensory apparatus gets deformed or stretched, and that's going to cause a stimulus which sends a signal back to the sensory posterior root to the spinal cord. This is what's called a mixed nerve, so it has also an efferent signaling pathway back to the muscle. Now, how do we look at this, right? If this muscle spindle gets stretched and if the tendon, which is called a Golgi tendon organ, if that gets stretched, it's going to send signals back to your spinal cord and brain. And this is kind of what helps you sort of be sort of innately aware of your body position, where your place in space is, where your body parts are without even really looking at them. That's part of the sensory information that your brain and your spinal cord are constantly gathering just to help you be aware of your body orientation and where your body parts are, which is really important. So let's say your muscles get stretched here, and some of the fibers that have a spindle sensory apparatus around it also get stretched. If it gets stretched really far, the rate of action potential signaling, so the frequency, how often those action potentials are sent over a given time interval, is very frequent. If the muscle is not stretched, if it's relaxed, this sensory apparatus is not going to send frequent action potentials. So the number of action potentials represented by these vertical bars here, that is reduced in frequency over a given time interval. And so this is how we can sort of tell how far our muscles are stretched. Our brain will interpret how frequent those sensory signal action potentials are coming back from our muscle spindles and sort of be able to determine, is my knee flexed really far, or is it kind of flexed, or is my leg totally extended and my knee's not flexed, for example. When a doctor is testing your patellar tendon reflex, your doctor is testing essentially, in part, your proprioception, right? This word, proprioception, is your ability to sense your position and location and orientation and movement of your body and its parts without even looking at it, right? You don't have to look at your fingers to know whether or not they're curled. You don't have to look at your arm to know whether or not your elbow is flexed. You can kind of feel that it is. And sometimes we're not even consciously aware that we are understanding where our body parts are and what their position is. But when you really think about it, you can kind of tell without looking down at your feet or looking down at your legs whether or not your knees are bent or whether or not your knees are straight. This awareness of where your body parts are is proprioception. Really, really good athletes are generally really very, very proprioceptive. So elite athletes know where their body parts are and can respond and have great balance and move and know what they need to do to move their bodies in a very precise and controlled and powerful way. We can have deficiencies in proprioception. Like I have a little visual deficiency, so I use eyeglasses, right? Our sense of sight is one of our senses. Proprioception is also a sense that's really important for the human body, and so In some cases, people can be proprioceptive deficient. Occupational therapy can help with this at times. Um, and then sometimes, honestly, people are just clumsy. And sometimes that clumsiness is due to some issues related to a person's proprioceptive ability. All right, so let's talk about some of these reflex arcs. Let's say you reach out and grab a hot pan and it hurts, but before you even know that it hurts, you draw your arm back and release contact with that hot pan handle or something like that. Now, when the stimulus is on one side of the body and then your reaction is on the same side of the body, that reflex, we call it ipsilateral. Ipsa means same side, so the same lateral side of the body. So let's say you have some painful stimulus, that's going to activate a receptor. In some case, you can have an associative or an interneuron in the gray matter area of the spinal cord here. And, all of this stuff is probably myelinated, but when you get to the terminal end bulbs of this neuron, that's not myelinated, which is why this area is gray matter. This is a cell body and probably dendrites, and this is a short neuron, so its axon would not be myelinated, and these end bulbs are not myelinated, and this might be a cell body with some dendrites, and so this portion of this neuron is not myelinated. And again, that explains all of this region of the spinal cord being gray matter, because I'm sure you recall, gray matter is non-myelinated regions of nerve cells, and white matter, of course, is myelinated regions. Anyway, if the sensation occurs on the same side and then the motor signal goes back out the same side of the body, that's ipsilateral. And often what will happen is you will remove yourself from this painful stimulus before your brain even registers, oh, that hurts, which is really important because this is going to decrease the amount of time that it takes to remove yourself from that painful situation, which saves us from some traumatic injury, right? Sometimes reflexes are monosynaptic. So what that means is that the sensory nerve could be in direct contact with the reacting motor nerve. All right, and there's only one synapse. Recall that a synapse is a connection between one neuron and another cell. It could be a neuron to another neuron, or a neuron to a muscle, or a neuron to a gland. But if you just have one synapse, this is characterized as a monosynaptic reflex arc. If an interneuron or an associative neuron is going to facilitate or sort of translate the communication from a sensory neuron to a motor neuron, there's a synapse there, there's a synapse there, so it's fair to call it a polysynaptic reflex arc. All right, let's talk about a contralateral reflex arc. Contra means against. So let's say you were to be walking along and you didn't have any shoes on and you stepped on a pin or you stepped on a Lego or something like that. My kids have Legos, and so if I'm walking through the house and I don't have shoes on and I step on a Lego, it hurts like crazy. Well, what happens, right? When you step on something that's painful, you immediately draw back that same leg. So you have an ipsilateral reflex here, but if you draw back that leg and lift up that foot, you're going to need to contract muscles on the other side of your body to bear the weight of yourself. Otherwise, you fall over, right? So you pick up one leg, and then you're going to contract muscles on the other side of your body to bear your weight so that you can pick up the leg that's attached to the foot that's being damaged by whatever it is you're stepping on. So this is an ipsilateral reflex arc here on this part of the diagram. This is the contralateral reflex pathway, right? So this associative interneuron is going to cross over from one side of the spinal cord to the other side of the spinal cord. And this area right here in the spinal cord, this is called the commissure or the white commissure. That allows for what's called communication from one side of the body to the other side of the body, which is why the commissure is called the commissure. So the word commissure begins with the same root of the same word as communication does. All right, so this is one other thing that doctors sometimes test in developing children. They're going to rub their thumbs very vigorously on the bottom of a child's foot, or even an adult patient if there's some suspicion that there's a nervous system disorder, right? So if you rub vigorously on the bottom of a little infant's foot, just born, they're going to exhibit what's called the Babinski sign. But after about the age of 1 and toward the age of 2, the reflex should be a plantar sort of curling reflex. So you should have some what's called plantar flexion in your foot rather than dorsiflexion in the foot, right? After the age of 2, if children are exhibiting a Babinski sign, that could be a sign that there's a disorder with the nervous system. Or perhaps if a person is suspected of having a stroke or something, if they show Babinski sign, that can be confirmation that there's stroke. Or maybe there's something else going on that might lead a doctor to think that maybe there's a nervous system disorder. A Babinski reflex diagnostic test might be done, and if a Babinski sign is seen, that's generally that there's an indicator of problem. It could be something like a stroke. It could be something like ALS, which is also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, or perhaps perhaps multiple sclerosis is happening. So there's a whole host of reasons why this could happen, but this is not a good sign in an individual that's older than 2 years old. All right, sometimes we can have reflexes that aren't based in body movement, right? So let's say, for example, you get thrown into some really, really cold water, right? You have an autonomic visceral reflex, right? You're gonna, right? You're gonna gasp, right? That is technically body movement, I guess, because you're gonna all of a sudden draw in air. And this is something that people that are trained to swim in cold water work to try to control. Because if you go into cold water and your head is under the water and you have the gasp reflex, well, your lungs are you're going to draw in water to your lungs, and that's not good. You can also have sort of visceral reflex responses to stimulus like wonderful cooking smells, and or me even mentioning maybe your favorite food is I don't know, tater tots. If you start thinking about tater tots, you might start salivating, and your pancreas and the duodenum of your small intestine might start producing digestive enzymes, right? So you can have reflexes in response to stimulus that isn't necessarily involving skeletal muscle. All right, a little bit on nervous system disorders and disease, right? Obviously, a really bad problem is if the spinal cord is injured. And let me just sort of have all these things open here for you. And there's varying levels of paralysis. And you can read through this. I'm not gonna read to you. You can read, but you can pause the video and read what these different types of paralysis levels are about, right? If you have transection of the spinal cord, this is going to compromise sensation and obviously motor signaling anywhere inferior to that transection. And this is what happens when you break your back or you break your neck. You can have severe injuries to the spinal cord, and of course, the functioning and the sensation of your body is severely compromised as a result. And the issue with this, of course, is that central nervous system nerves don't repair. So brain injuries and spinal cord injuries are really devastating, really devastating. Let me go back here. I'm sorry. Oops. Do you remember from the last presentation, one of those little memory mnemonics, C3, C4, and C5? Those are the spinal roots that keep you alive. I don't know if you know who this person is. All right, this is a picture of an actor, young actor named Christopher Reeve, and he was originally the actor that portrayed Superman in the Superman movies that were produced and released in the 1980s, I believe. Well, not only was he an actor, but he was an equestrian, right? So he rode horses. And he was riding in a competition where the horses sort of jump over the bars and have sort of an obstacle course that they go around and through. And he was thrown from his horse, and he landed on his head, and he broke his neck. And the result was that he was paralyzed. This is because his injury was superior to the C3 nerve root. And if you recall, the C3 and C4 and C5 nerve roots lead to that phrenic nerve. And one of the things that happened to Christopher Reeve was he stopped breathing. And, you know, there were medical people there right away, and they got him breathing again. But for the rest of his life, he was on a ventilator. He had to rely on a machine to push air into and out of his lungs. And he and his wife started this Christopher Reeve Paralysis Foundation. And they raised a whole bunch of money that went to researching treatments and eventually, hopefully, trying to cure some of these devastating spinal cord injuries. He did eventually pass away, and sadly, his wife, who doted on him and cared for him, in those years that he was in this condition. She passed away shortly thereafter. It was a really tragic story of these two. A little bit more on some disorders and disease of nervous system, right? Please recall, peripheral nerves can have some limited ability to repair and regenerate. When your nerves are inflamed, we call that neuritis, and that could be due to some trauma or injury or sometimes some type of infection. Neuropathy is a little bit different, right? Neuropathy is when you have your nerves just aren't functioning properly, and you might have a burning sensation or maybe numbness and weakness. Um, this is sometimes associated with diabetes and sometimes associated with chemotherapy treatments. If a cancer patient is on chemotherapy, they can um, have something called neuropathy, which is a little bit different than neuritis. Sciatica is neuritis of the sciatic nerve. So you might have some type of inflammation or impingement of the sciatic nerve, generally due to a herniated vertebral disc in the lumbar region, because that actually pinches on some of those lumbar spinal roots, which lead to the sciatic nerve. And that's not fun if you have sciatica. Shingles is a reemergence of chickenpox. Now, I bet many of you haven't had chickenpox because on or about the time when you were young children, the chickenpox vaccine became available. So maybe some of you had the chickenpox vaccine, and so you avoided getting the chickenpox. When I was a child, I had the chickenpox, and so I'm at risk of getting the shingles. So there's another vaccine that I will probably get in the next few years here to try to prevent myself from getting the shingles. Shingles is like the chickenpox virus coming back, and it actually infects the ends of your nerves in and around your skin. And so generally what's associated with that, some really nasty sort of bloody, scaly plaques that develop, and they kind of flake off, kind of like shingles on a roof can sort of peel away. So that's why it's called shingles. It's really painful and not pleasant. So if you did get the chickenpox as a child, my advice would be, when you're older, about my age, get the vaccine that's going to prevent you or help prevent you from getting shingles. Okay, that's it for this presentation. Hopefully this helped you understand some new stuff. Thanks, everyone.